Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today, we're diving headfirst into a question that, at first glance, seems pretty straightforward. What truly defines a Muslim?
Yeah, but as we're about to find out, that question is anything but simple, especially when you get into the details.
Exactly. We're exploring the Ahmadiyya case of South Africa, a really pivotal court battle. It unfolded in Cape Town, between 1982 and 1985?
That's right. It's a fascinating mix of legal arguments, deep theological debates, and quite a bit of history all rolled into one.
Okay, so who are the main players here?
Well, you had the plaintiffs, the Lahore Ahmadiyya Muslims, and on the other side, the defendants were various Sunni Muslim religious bodies. The main one leading the charge was the Muslim Judicial Council, the MJC.
Got it. And our mission for you listening is to really dig into the core arguments from the court documents, the theological points, the historical accounts. Because this wasn't just some dry legal dispute, was it?
Not at all. It's like a window into how complex religious identity can be, who gets to decide, how things are interpreted. And honestly, there are some surprising facts and angles here that really make you think about how these religious differences play out, in society and even in the courts.
Okay, so let's get right to the heart of it. This definition of a Muslim. What was the Lahore Ahmadiyya position? How did they start their argument?
So the Lahore Ahmadiyya plaintiffs came in with a remarkably clear stance. They basically said, look, Islam is founded on fundamental principles. We all know the 5 pillars, for instance. Yeah. And they said, we accept these tenets, therefore we are Muslims. Simple as that, in their view.
And what was the absolute core of that definition for them? What did they really zero in on?
Their primary point, the absolute bedrock, was professing the kalima. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. They argued that just saying that, professing it, is enough for someone to be considered a Muslim. And they pointed out this wasn't some new idea they cooked up. They said this definition was relied upon by their own movement historically, and it was even the basis used when demanding the creation of Pakistan. So it had real historical weight.
That's a strong opening position. What kind of proof, like historical or theological evidence, did they present to back up focusing so heavily on the kalima?
Oh, they brought a lot. They pointed to teachings directly from the Holy Prophet Muhammad. There are loads of hadith sayings and actions of the Prophet where people came into Islam just by reciting the kalima.
With specific examples?
Yeah, really powerful ones. Like Summa ibn Yusal, just saying the words brought him into the fold. Or there's a story of a dying Jewish boy. The Prophet was there, and reciting the kalima was presented as saving him from hellfire. And the Prophet himself famously said, Islam is based on 5 things, and the very first one is testifying to the kalima, then prayer, charity, pilgrimage, fasting.
So the kalima comes first. And this wasn't just like an early days thing. This idea carried on.
Absolutely. They showed a clear consensus through history. You have major figures like Imam Ghazali, back in the 11th century, saying that outwardly, if someone says the kalima, they're a Muslim. Then Imam Ibn Taymiyyah in the 14th century points out that, the proof of someone being Muslim has to be something everyone can know, right? An outward thing.
Not trying to read minds, basically.
Exactly. And it continues with later scholars. Sayyid Muhammad Ismail Shahid in the 1800s converting Sikhs with just the kalima. The Sheikh al-Islam of Constantinople in 1888 affirmed it. Even modern theologians they cited, like Maulana Shabir Ahmad Usmani and Dr. Israr Ahmad, all agreed the kalima is the gateway.
So the plaintiffs lay out this really clear, historically grounded definition. Makes you wonder, how did the defendants respond? It seems like a tough argument to counter directly.
Well, yeah, the contrast was pretty striking. The defendants, the MJC and others initially tried to argue that, there are further fundamental doctrines needed beyond just the kalima.
Okay, like what?
That was the problem. They really struggled to actually name them, to specify what these extra essential beliefs were.
That's telling. So what happened then?
Eventually, they had to concede. They admitted in court that they cannot give any positive definition of a Muslim, which is quite an admission.
Wow. So instead of defining what a Muslim is,
they fell back on a negative definition,
Nice
basically
job.
saying whoever holds Ahmadi beliefs is a non-Muslim. That was their position. It's actually very similar, interestingly, to how the Pakistani constitution defines the situation regarding Ahmadis there, defining by exclusion.
Yeah, defining by what someone isn't rather than what they are. And this touches on that point about judging intent versus just accepting the outward declaration.
Exactly. There's that famous hadith where the Prophet says something like, I haven't been commanded to split open people's hearts or look inside them to see their true intentions. The tradition really emphasizes the outward profession for, legal status as a Muslim within the community. And this led directly to the plaintiff's main complaint, their grievance. They were being called kafir, unbeliever, and apostate, murtad. The defendants were publishing these things, and the plaintiffs argued it was false, defamatory, and it was actively inciting hatred, leading to violence, social boycotts.
Things like being barred from mosques.
Exactly. Denied entry to mosques, denied burial in Muslim cemeteries, basic rights being stripped away based on these declarations.
Okay, now another big part of this, like in so many court cases, was about jurisdiction. The defendants challenged the court's right to even rule on this, didn't they?
They did. They argued that a secular court, like the one in Cape Town, was not appropriate to decide what they called purely ecclesiastical issues, purely religious matters.
So what should happen instead, according to them?
They wanted the court to just accept the rulings of international bodies of Islamic ecclesiastical opinion. They initially mentioned 4 such bodies, but later that number somehow grew to 12.
But the judge didn't buy that argument.
Not at all. Judge Berman gave a very clear ruling on this, July 24th, 1985. He completely rejected it. He said, and this is a direct quote, "Our courts have never lacked the courage to deal with doctrinal disputes where this has been necessary, nor have they shirked an obligation to do so when faced therewith."
Pretty decisive language. So the court asserted its authority. And this wasn't the first time secular courts had dealt with Islamic law issues, was it?
No, far from it. The plaintiffs pointed to plenty of precedents, both in South Africa and India, where courts with non-Muslim judges had made rulings based on Islamic law and practice. Cases about mosque appointments, personal law like marriage and inheritance, even disputes between different Sunni groups.
Right.
In fact, the Muslim Judicial Council itself had previously been involved in cases where the secular court had to interpret Islamic principles. So their argument against jurisdiction seemed a bit inconsistent.
It sounds a bit like they knew they might be on shaky ground with the actual religious arguments.
That's certainly how the plaintiffs saw it. They accused the defendants of using tactics to delay and avoid the main issue, trying to get the case thrown out on technicalities, dragging things out. The defendants themselves admitted the evidence would be extremely complex, protracted, and technical.
Which maybe suggested they felt it was going to be hard to win on the substance.
Possibly. The plaintiffs suggested the defendants realized it was almost impossible to make out a religious case against them which can pass the scrutiny of an impartial body like an independent court of law. Hence, all the procedural wrangling and amendments to their own arguments.
Okay, let's pivot then to the specific Ahmadiyya beliefs that were at the center of the controversy, especially around prophethood and revelation. What did the court hear about Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad's core beliefs?
His followers, the Lahore Ahmadis, were very clear. They affirmed belief in the absolute unity of Allah, the Holy Quran as the final scripture, the Holy Prophet Muhammad as the true and final law-bearing prophet, and all the 5 pillars, the fundamentals of Islam. They explicitly stated, "We have neither added to nor taken away anything from the religion of Islam."
But the main accusation, the one you always hear, is that Ahmadis don't believe Muhammad is the final prophet, the Khatam an-Nabiyyin. How do they address that?
Hazrat Mirza himself addressed it very directly in his writings, which were presented. He said, quote, "I believe that the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the Khatam an-Nabiyyin." And again, "I believe in God and his messenger, and I also believe that the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, is the Khatam an-Nabiyyin." Unequivocal statements.
So how did he interpret Khatam an-Nabiyyin then, if not last prophet ever, full stop?
His interpretation, which they explained, is that it means seal of the prophets, like a seal of approval or finality in terms of law. It means no prophet bringing a new religious law, a new Sharia, can come after Muhammad. His law is final.
Okay, that's a key distinction, no new law. But does that leave room for other kinds of divine communication? How did they explain that?
This gets into the nuances of revelation in Islam. The Ahmadiyya view, presented in court, is that true religion needs a living God who speaks to his servants. They make a distinction between 2 types of revelation, or way.
Okay.
There's way nubuat, that's the revelation specific to prophets, the kind that brings new laws or scriptures. That, they fully agree, ended with Prophet Muhammad. But then there's way wilayat.
Way wilayat, what's that?
That's revelation given to saints, or awliya. And this type, they argue, continues. It hasn't stopped.
What does that kind of revelation look like? What form does it take?
It can be things like divine inspiration, like a strong feeling or idea from God. It can be hearing words or receiving true dreams. These true dreams are even mentioned in hadith as mubashirat, good news, and sometimes called a part of prophethood. Not full prophethood, but a part of that divine connection.
Right. Were there examples given of people who weren't prophets receiving this kind of communication in Islamic history?
Yes, plenty. They mention Moses' mother receiving divine instruction about baby Moses. Or Mary, the mother of Jesus, spoken to by angels. Even some very famous companions of the Prophet Muhammad, like Abu Bakr or Umar, Abu ibn Kabi, Abdullah ibn Zayd ibn Abdurrabi. There are accounts of them receiving divine communications, visions, hearing voices.
So it's not unheard of.
Not at all. And respected theologians supported this. Imam Rahib defined way as something given to his prophets and his saints. Imam Ghazali wrote about knowledge coming through inspiration, true dreams, or waking visions. So the concept of ongoing non-prophetic revelation has strong roots.
Okay, so putting Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad into this framework, what did he actually claim for himself?
He claimed to be a reformer, a mujaddid, for the 14th Islamic century, a spiritual guide for both the outward law, Sharia, and the inner spiritual path, tariqat. He also claimed to be the promised Messiah and the Mahdi.
And how did he mean that?
Yeah.
Literally Jesus returned.
No, he stressed it was in a metaphorical and spiritual sense. He was not claiming to be a new prophet bringing a new law, and certainly not a physical return of Jesus. He consistently said, the doors of real prophethood are fully closed after the last of the prophets, the holy prophet Muhammad.
And he tested his own revelations.
Yes. Critically, he said his revelations had to be judged against the Holy Quran and the Hadith. If they contradicted those core sources, they weren't from God. This is a key feature of why wilayat, saintly revelation, it's subordinate to the established scripture. Why nubuwat, prophetic revelation, stands on its own.
So when terms like follower prophet were used for him.
That terminology, they explained, denoted a muhaddas, someone who receives divine communication, a saint who shares some characteristics with prophets, but isn't a prophet in the technical, law-giving sense.
This leads nicely into the whole issue of language, specifically the language of Sufism, Islamic mysticism. It seems a lot of the attacks centered on Hazrat Mirza, using words like prophet, nabi, or messenger, Rasul for himself.
Exactly. And this was a major part of the plaintiff's case, explaining that this language needs to be understood within its proper context, the context of Sufi terminology.
How so?
They argued that in Sufism, such terms are often used metaphorically to describe high spiritual states, not in their literal technical meaning. It's a language born from intense spiritual experience, and it can sound, well, pretty radical if you take it literally and out of that specific context.
Could you give some examples of these Sufi concepts that allow for that kind of language?
Sure. There's a concept called fana for Rasul. It means something like annihilation in the prophet. It describes a state where a mystic becomes so spiritually absorbed in the Prophet Muhammad, so aligned with his qualities, that they are seen as a reflection, almost like a mirror, of the prophet himself.
Okay.
Then there's Zilli Nubuwat, which means shadow or reflection of prophethood. This is basically seen as synonymous with high sainthood, wilayat. It refers to spiritual achievements gained through perfect obedience to the prophet, reflecting his light.
A reflection, not the original source.
Precisely. And similar is Buruzi Nubuwat, or manifestation of prophethood. Again, it's about the prophet's light being manifested in a saint, making them like a spiritual copy or reflection of the original. It's about connection and emulation, not replacement.
So these terms describe a really deep spiritual bond, not a claim to be the prophet or a new prophet in the same sense.
Exactly. And the plaintiffs showed this wasn't unique to Hazrat Mirza at all. They provided numerous examples of highly revered Sufi saints throughout history who used language that sounded just as, if not more, extreme or exaggerated.
Like who?
Well, take Abu Yazid Bustami, a famous 9th century Sufi. He's recorded as saying things like, "Glory be to, how great is my majesty," and even, "I am Adam, I am Noah, I am Abraham, I am Moses, I am Jesus, I am Muhammad." Clearly metaphorical descriptions of encompassing spiritual state.
Wow, that's bold language.
Extremely. Or Sayyid Abdul Qadir Jilani, hugely respected, founder of the Qadiriyya Sufi order. He apparently said, "My foot is on the neck of every saint of Allah." And even, "I was certainly Muhammad. Otherwise, what I had said would merely have been relating something from the Holy Prophet." Again, implying that deep unity, that fana.
It does sound like a pattern.
It is. Jalaluddin Rumi, the famous poet, said, "Each one of us sages is a messiah for the world." His mentor, Shamsuddin of Tabriz, wrote, "I am the spirit which was breathed into Mary. I am the soul, which was the life of Jesus.
So the point being made in court was
That Hazrat Mirza's language, while perhaps startling to outsiders, fits squarely within this long-standing Sufi tradition of metaphorical expression for profound spiritual experiences. And importantly, many of these historical Sufis were also accused of heresy or being kafir by more literalist scholars of their own time. It's a recurring theme.
history repeating itself in a way. And did Hazrat Mirza himself give guidance on how his followers should use these terms?
Yes, he did. While these terms appeared in his recorded revelations, he specifically told his followers not to use them in everyday conversation or common talk within the community. He wanted to avoid misunderstanding and repeatedly stressed, as we said, prophethood has terminated with the Holy Prophet Muhammad.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit to another controversial topic. Jihad. The accusation was often that Ahmadis had somehow reinterpreted or even rejected jihad, and also this issue of loyalty to the British in India. What's the actual meaning of jihad?
Fundamentally, jihad just means to strive or to exert oneself, usually for a righteous cause. It's a very broad term. It's distinct from qitl, which specifically means physical fighting or warfare.
So jihad isn't just about war.
Not at all. The Quran and Hadith talk about jihad with one's wealth, with one's tongue speaking truth, debating with one's hands through actions, and with one's life. There's even the greater jihad, which is the struggle against one's own negative inclinations. And propagating Islam using the Quran is called the mighty jihad.
So physical fighting, qitl, is just one specific type.
Yes, and according to mainstream Islamic jurisprudence, it's permissible only under very strict conditions, typically self-defense against aggression, when Muslims face severe persecution, if the aim is to destroy Islam, and the goal must be purely defensive, protecting religious freedom.
So why did Hazrat Mirza feel the need to really emphasize this broader meaning of jihad? What was happening at the time?
Two main things. First, Christian missionaries in India were heavily attacking Islam, claiming it was spread by violence, by the sword. So Mirza felt the need to defend Islam and clarify the true meaning of jihad to counter these criticisms.
Okay.
Second, he was also pushing back against what he saw as a distorted understanding of jihad among some Muslim clerics, some Malavis at the time. He called their interpretation, which focused solely on fighting and plunder, incorrect and even beast-like, saying it led to pointless violence.
So he was trying to correct misinterpretations from both outside and inside the Muslim community.
Exactly. He strongly emphasized that, in his time, the main battlefield was intellectual and spiritual. The pen, he said, was the necessary weapon to fight the dangerous war of ideas launched by missionaries. He called this intellectual defense the duty of every Muslim.
Right. Now, what about that charge of being loyal to the British, often framed as being disloyal to other Muslims or anti-independence?
This needs context. It's true, Hazrat Mirza advocated loyalty to the ruling British government. But, and this is crucial, he wasn't alone in this. Many very prominent mainstream Muslim leaders and theologians at the time, including scholars from the influential Deoband school and figures like Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, also publicly declared loyalty to the British and argued against armed rebellion or military jihad against them.
Why did they take that position?
Their reasoning was based on Islamic law itself. They argued that British India, despite being non-Muslim ruled, allowed Muslims freedom of religion and security. In such a situation, which they considered Darul Aman, land of security, or even a form of Darul Islam, land of Islam, because of religious freedom, Islam forbids armed rebellion against the rulers.
So Mirza's stance wasn't some unique betrayal, but actually aligned with a significant stream of Muslim thought at the time.
Correct. It was a pragmatic position shared by many leaders who believed it was the best way to ensure the safety and progress of the Muslim community under the prevailing circumstances. He was actually attacked from both sides. Some Muslims called him a British agent, while some British officials were suspicious of him too. A difficult position.
Okay, this brings us back to something we touched on earlier, the use of fatwas, of kufr, declaring people unbelievers. The defendants used this against the Ahmadis, but the plaintiffs turned this around, didn't they? Showing it was a common tactic.
Yes, they really highlighted the irony. They presented evidence showing that issuing fatwas of kufr was historically a very common practice, not just against groups like Ahmadis, but between different mainstream Sunni sects themselves, often over relatively minor disagreements described as trivial grounds.
So Sunni groups declaring other Sunni groups to be kafir.
Frequently. They cited the Munir Report, a Pakistani government inquiry from 1953 into anti-Ahmadiyya riots. That report famously concluded that among the Pakistani ulama, the religious scholars, no two learned divines are agreed on this fundamental definition of a Muslim. And because they couldn't agree on who is a Muslim, the grounds for declaring someone not a Muslim an apostate were too numerous to count.
That's quite a statement from an official inquiry.
It really is. It shows how contested these definitions were internally, and then the plaintiffs presented this powerful historical counter-narrative.
Which was?
They listed numerous highly revered figures in Islamic history, founders of law schools, compilers of hadith, great Sufi saints, philosophers who were themselves persecuted, imprisoned, flogged, exiled, or declared kafir by the religious or political authorities of their own day.
Can you give some examples? It really drives the point home.
Absolutely. Imam Abu Hanifa, founder of the Hanafi school of law, was imprisoned and possibly poisoned. Imam Shafi'i, another major law school founder, was accused of heresy and dragged to Baghdad in chains. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal faced severe persecution, imprisonment, and flogging for his theological stance.
Even figures like Bukhari, who compiled the famous Hadith collection.
Yes, Imam Bukhari faced accusations and exile. Imam Nasai, another hadith compiler, was reportedly beaten to death. Sufi giants like Hallaj was executed. Ibn Arabi faced constant accusations. Abdul Qadir Jilani was called kafir, Rumi too. Even Imam Ghazali, a hugely influential figure who reconciled Sufism and Orthodox theology, faced accusations of kufr.
So the message was, being declared kafir by contemporary clerics doesn't automatically mean you're outside Islam. Historically, it often meant you were challenging the status quo.
Precisely. It showed that this kind of condemnation has often been directed at reformers and original thinkers throughout Islamic history. It puts the attacks on Ahmadis in a very different light.
And how did the Lahore Ahmadis say they viewed other Muslims given all this?
They were very clear in court. They stated they do not declare any Muslim who recites the kalima to be a kafir, full stop. They also stated they are willing to pray behind any Muslim imam, provided that imam doesn't publicly declare them to be kafir.
So the reason they sometimes prayed separately wasn't because they thought other Muslims were non-Muslims.
No, it was a reaction to being excluded and denounced. Hazrat Mirza himself initially prayed behind non-Ahmadi imams. He only advised separate prayers after Ahmadis started being physically expelled from mosques and loudly condemned as kafir during prayers by some imams. It was presented as a defensive measure against persecution, not an act of theological separation initiated by them.
Okay, so we've gone through the core arguments, the historical context, the theological debates. After all that, what was the final verdict in the Ahmadiyya case of South Africa?
Well, in the end, the defendants, the MJC and others, actually withdrew from the case before a final judgment on all the merits was delivered after all the evidence was heard.
They withdrew. Why?
The record suggests they realized the way the evidence had come out was not favorable to them. Their withdrawal led the court to issue an order essentially in favor of the plaintiffs. The court declared that the members of the Lahore Ahmadiyya community are Muslims.
And what did that mean practically?
It meant they were entitled to all the rights and privileges that come with being Muslim in that society, specifically including the right to be admitted to mosques and to be buried in Muslim cemeteries, the very things they were being denied. The court also criticized the defendants for withdrawing late in the process, forcing the plaintiffs to incur significant extra costs, stating it disfavored their conduct.
Was the outcome reported accurately everywhere?
Not entirely. Interestingly, some newspapers back in Pakistan initially reported that the South African court had declared Ahmadis to be kafir, the complete opposite of the actual outcome. This misinformation had to be formally corrected through complaints to the press council. Shows how narratives can be twisted.
Definitely. Beyond the court case itself was evidence presented about how Hazrat Mirza, or the Lahore Ahmadiyya movement, were viewed by other prominent Muslims, to counter the idea they were universally condemned.
Yes, absolutely. The plaintiffs presented tributes to Hazrat Mirza from various notable figures, even some who later became critics. People praised his immense scholarship, his powerful defense of Islam against attacks from Christian missionaries and Hindu Arya-Samajists, calling his writings a literary revolution. Figures like Sir Syed Ahmad Khan initially, and even Muhammad Hussein Batalvi, who became a fierce opponent, had earlier acknowledged his services. Dr. Sir Muhammad Iqbal, the famous poet-philosopher, also praised Mirza's role as a great fighter for Islam in his early phase.
So, recognition for his defense of Islam. And what about the Lahore Ahmadiyya movement itself?
The movement got significant recognition, especially for Maulana Muhammad Ali's English translation of the Quran. It was the first English translation by a Muslim widely available in the West and was hugely influential. People acknowledged the movement's extensive efforts in spreading Islam globally, particularly in Europe. Figures associated with the Pakistan movement, like M.A. Jinnah and Allama Iqbal himself, had shown appreciation for their work at various times.
Now, you mentioned the story didn't quite end in 1985. There was another related case a couple of years later, the Ahmadi sympathizer case.
That's right. In 1987, also in Cape Town, the issue of defining a Muslim came up again, indirectly. Maulana Hafiz Shah Muhammad, who was a key expert witness for the Lahore Ahmadis in the first case, testified again.
And what happened in that case?
The court again seemed unconvinced by the arguments seeking to declare someone non-Muslim easily. It noted that the expert witness brought in by the MJC from Pakistan, Professor Ghazi, appeared biased against Ahmadis.
And the MJC's arguments were?
They were arguing for a kind of guilt by association, suggesting that things like using an Ahmadi lawyer or even selling a house to an Ahmadi could be grounds for declaring someone an apostate. The court called this a rigor of the prescription, suggesting it was overly harsh.
So the court pushed back on that.
Yes. Crucially, the appeal court found that the MJC hadn't followed the proper Islamic procedural requirements for declaring someone an apostate, takfir. And it stated it was far from clear that merely being an Ahmadi sympathizer would religiously justify being branded an apostate. The final judgment explicitly stated the court seems to have preferred Sher Muhammad's evidence, the Lahore Ahmadi expert on the religious questions.
So another instance where the court leaned towards a more inclusive definition, or at least demanded a much higher burden of proof for exclusion.
Exactly. It shows these issues kept coming back, and the legal system continued to play a role in challenging very rigid, exclusionary religious definitions.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, what does this deep dive really tell us? For you, our listener, it seems pretty clear that a question like, who is a Muslim, which sounds simple, is actually incredibly complex, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's tangled up in centuries of history, complex theology, different interpretations, and deeply personal beliefs.
And we've seen how these deeply felt religious differences can escalate into major legal battles, and how secular courts sometimes have to step in and, well, draw lines or make judgments when the religious bodies themselves can't agree. It highlights these moments of perhaps unexpected justice or resistance within the legal system.
Yeah, and it really underscores that constant human tendency to define us versus them and how powerful and sometimes damaging those definitions can be.
So here's something to leave you with. In our world today, which is obviously increasingly connected, diverse, where religious identity is so personal but also so publicly debated and contested. What is the role, the ongoing responsibility of secular institutions like courts? Should they be involved in these traditionally religious questions? And maybe, how does that fundamental human impulse to draw lines between groups, to define who belongs and who doesn't, how does that continue to shape how we understand faith, how we build communities, and ultimately how we relate to each other as human beings?